Just to let you know, the meeting is on Thursday, April 17th, 2019 at 4:35 p.m. I'd been at the Federal Justice Complex at Joint Base Milton all day, testifying and answering questions nonstop. It was 4:35 p.m., and I was tired. I'd been in a cramped room with only a TV and my thoughts for over 2 hours. I was starting to wonder when I'd get to see someone else. The board would finally reach their decision just then. The door opened and Commander Jack Tanner, my legal rep, stepped in. "They're done for the day," Lieutenant Turner told me. He said I could go by Jack to friends and family. "I'm a senior flight lieutenant in the United States Space Corps, formerly known as the Space Force, which was established almost 80 years ago. They want you back at 8:00 a. It's 4:35 p.m. Tomorrow, head back to your quarters," Commander Tanner instructed. "And remember, no talking to the other witnesses, especially your wife." "You mean my Sunab ex-wife, the one who was unfaithful?" I clarified, my words laced with bitterness. He nodded, confirming my suspicions. "Yes, sir," I replied, standing up. "I'll be on my way. Just stay out of trouble." "Yes, sir," I replied, stretching, grabbing my case, and heading out. I drove my small electric car back to the Bach, where I quickly changed clothes and microwaved a veggie burger. I had a burger and grabbed a cold beer after a quick meal. I settled into my chair, turned on the TV to check the news, but found nothing worth watching. I leaned back and let my thoughts drift over the events of the past few weeks. Until recently, I'd been serving as the weapons officer aboard the USS Liberty, which was atop. I'm not sure what happened next. The USS Liberty was a top-of-the-line spacecraft named after an iconic American symbol. It housed a crew of 110 and carried an impressive array of firepower nuclear missiles, energy weapons, rail guns, and mini lasers. The Liberty's maiden voyage to Saturn was supposed to be special, not just because of the mission itself, but because my wife Camila was also on board as the chief pilot. We were high school sweethearts who'd promised each other fidelity and shared a dream of exploring space together, despite being stationed at the same base. Our assignments often kept us apart, but I never once doubted her loyalty while she was away on missions. I threw myself into training in Graft, TCH, a martial art designed for low-gravity environments, and honed my skills. I had no reason to doubt her, and I never even considered the possibility of her being unfaithful. Of course, there were temptations, but I stayed true to our relationship, never imagining she'd betray me. We often fantasized about being together in zero gravity on the Moon or Mars, experiencing the kind of closeness only space could offer. So when we both got orders for the Liberty, and it felt like our dreams were finally coming true. But what started as a dream quickly turned into a nightmare. I remember the day we launched like it was yesterday. It was Friday, January 3, 2019, at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I was suited up and deep in thought as I boarded the shuttle that would take me to the Liberty. Camila, the chief pilot, had left earlier that morning on the first shuttle. I was on the third shuttle with 3 more scheduled to follow. I was seated next to Commander Rick Harrison, better known as Ironclad for his sheer size and tough demeanor. We'd gone through the academy together, though we hadn't interacted much. Ironclad had been Camila's mentor, was a strict instructor, but we hadn't crossed paths much beyond that. "I was excited to serve with your wife, Turner," Ironclad asked in his deep voice. "Yes, sir, I am," trying to keep his voice steady. "This mission is going to make history," he remarked. "We're going further than we've ever gone to Saturn and back in under 120 days. Quite the journey," I said as the pumps beneath this word signaled our imminent launch. Ironclad grunted, time to say goodbye to Earth. He muttered this before reclining in his seat. We braced for liftoff, and as the shuttle rumbled beneath us, gravity's pull intensified through the window. I watched the clouds whip past as we ascended into the darkness. Earth's curve was visible below the boosters. The launch site was just an hour away, so we were detached with a jolt and heading back for reuse. About an hour later, we saw a massive structure in the distance. "That's the Ironclad," I said. "She'll be lifting off in a few 30 minutes. The shuttle approached the Liberty's open dock, and the connection was sealed with a hiss as the pressure equalized. "There we go," I said. "The ironclad is ready for takeoff. Get ready for gravity. We're running at zero." As we approached the Liberty from near zero gravity in the shuttle, I could feel the weight of my gear increase as we transitioned to the ship's artificial gravity system. I was grateful to feel the pull again. Without gravity, space can really take a toll on your body. I went to my cabin, hoping to find Camila, but she wasn't there. Her belongings were already neatly stowed, which was a clear sign she had arrived earlier. I changed into my flight suit, grabbed my cap, and made my way to the bridge. As the weapons officer, it was my job to make sure all our systems were in working order. The bridge was busy as I ran through my calibration routines, checking the missile platforms, energy weapons, and targeting systems. Everything had to be in perfect working order, especially under Captain Daniel Myers. "Nonsense, leader. I've served with you before." After submitting my report to Captain Myers, who recognized me from our last mission together, we verified the codes for the cruise missiles. 2 keys are required for launch, one held by the captain, one by me. "Good to have you aboard, Turner." Captain Myers said, "I hear you're married to our chief pilot, Camila?" "Yes, sir," I responded. "Should make things interesting for you," he said with a smile. "I hope so, sir," I replied, glancing at Camila as she smiled mischievously at me before returning to her duties. Ironclad arrived on the bridge. His eyes were cold as ever. I went back to my station to make sure everything was ready. Myers had a habit of running weapons drills at unexpected times, so I had to be prepared as always. We started with a calibration check to ensure everything was perfect. Once that was done, Captain Myers initiated the final pre-launch procedures. Launch procedures. All systems were green. We were ready to launch. "All systems go." Myers called out, "Engines are running hot and steady." Lieutenant Scott, our chief engineer, replied, "Weapons systems are all set, calibrated and accounted for." I confirmed from my station navigation. Captain Mears asked, "Course is plotted and locked. ETA at Mars Station is 440 hours. Lieutenant Ryan, our navigator, reported, "All personnel in place and ready for LA punch," Ironclad said from his position. Myers nodded and pressed a button on his console. "Houston, this is Liberty requesting permission to launch. Launch authorization granted. Liberty, Godspeed." "Houston," Mears replied before turning to Camila. "Helmsman, take us out nice and easy." "Aye, sir," Camila responded, her hands moving swiftly over the controls. 2 levers pulled the control column in her hands. The Liberty inched forward, maneuvering thrusters guiding us out. Once we were clear of the dock, Camila engaged the main thrusters. The ship vibrated as the ion fusion engines roared to life, and we accelerated, leaving Earth behind and spiraling out of orbit towards Point Bravo. Camila announced, "Focus sharp." I could see the tracker on the navigator's console displaying our route, a perfect arc around the planet, heading out towards the moon as we left Earth's gravitational influence and approached the critical point. Where we'd ignite the full thrust, the navigator's voice came over the comms again. "ETA to Bravo Point is 2 minutes, sir." "All clear ahead, copy that, Captain Myers." The engines warmed up and were ready. Lieutenant Scott confirmed that they'd hit Point Bravo in 3, 2, 1. "Punch it," Myers commanded. Camila executed the order with precision, and the ship surged forward. The hum of the engines grew louder as the thrusters pushed us to speeds unimaginable. On Earth, I stole a quick glance at Camila. I could see pride swelling in my chest. She was good at what she did, and I couldn't help but smile at her. But as I turned back to my console, I caught a glimpse of Ironclad. His expression was stone cold, and his eyes were fixed on Camila. Something about his demeanor unsettled me, but I pushed the thought aside. We had a mission to focus on. An hour later, I turned as Ironclad posted the officer schedules for the coming shifts. I noticed something that made I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd been assigned to the second shift in space. We followed Houston's time schedule with simulated day and night shifts. Senior officers like myself usually took the first shift. Seeing my name on the second shift meant that I'd barely have any time with Camila. Her name was listed for the first shift, and the overlap between our schedules would be minimal. Just a few minutes during shift change, I clenched my fists. This felt like a demotion, and Ironclad knew it. "Is there a scheduling problem, Lieutenant Ironclad?" He cut through my anger with his voice, standing right in front of my console with his arms crossed. I stood up and met his gaze. "Am I still the senior weapons officer, sir?" "Yes, of course," he replied with a smirk. By then, Captain Myers had noticed the exchange and approached what seems to be the issue here. "Gentlemen, Lieutenant Turner isn't happy with the bridge schedule." "I see," said Myers, looking over the schedule and frowning. "I understand his concern. Number 1, it's highly unusual. Don't you agree?" "Yes, sir." "Normally I would agree, but Lieutenant Turner's skills are best used on the second shift. It also gives us a chance to train the other gunnery officers during the first shift." I knew he was full of it. This wasn't about training other officers. It was about keeping me away from Camila. Captain Myers wasn't buying it either. "Is that the only reason, Commander, or is there something more?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "If I may speak, I'd like to." "I agree, sir," Ironclad said. Myers replied, "I've never been a fan of spouses serving on the same ship, especially in close quarters. It's a distraction, and I don't want them losing focus on their duties." "I see," I said. "I understand your concerns, but I won't allow this to affect morale. Make sure they have time together." "Yes, sir," Ironclad said. The look in his eyes told me Captain Myers said, "Didn't mean it." He turned to me and asked, "Can you handle that, Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir," I replied through gritted teeth. "Good. Carry on," Myers said before walking away. Ironclad leaned in closer to me. His voice was barely a whisper. "Don't worry, Turner. I'll keep a close eye on your wife." He smirked before turning on his heel and walking off. I was left fuming at my station. I turned to Alice, who quickly put a finger to her lips. "Don't say anything, Jack. We'll talk later. I'll call Lieutenant Anderson." "Yes, ma'am," I muttered quietly. I glanced over at Camila, who was focused on her console. Her face was flushed. I couldn't tell if it was embarrassment or guilt. I felt humiliated. I left the bridge, my mind racing. Something was definitely off. I headed to the mess hall, hoping to grab something to eat. It wasn't meal time, so I figured the options would be limited. The guy behind the plexiglass partition shrugged as I approached. "Not much left," he said. "Lieutenant, we've got these artificial meat burgers. They taste awful, but they'll fill you up." "That'll do," I said, taking one on a tray. He handed me a packet of ketchup and grinned. "Want some axle grease to go with it?" he said. "Sure, why not?" I replied, with a weak smile, taking it. "The packet, thanks any time, Lieutenant," he said, nodding as I walked away to find a table. I sat down and ate in silence, trying to make the bland burger and ketchup more palatable. It wasn't great, but at least it filled me up. After finishing, I tossed the tray in the trash and headed back to my quarters. I lay down, hoping sleep would come, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Ironclad. What did he mean when he said that? After tossing and turning for about an hour, I gave up and threw on my workout clothes and headed for the gym on one of the lower decks. Thankfully, the place was empty, so I could work out some of my frustration without anyone around. I stretched, hit the treadmill for a bit, then moved to the weight machines. After that, I adjusted the gravity to 0. By the time I was done, I was drenched in sweat and finally ready to sleep. I reset the gravity and returned to my quarters, taking a quick shower in a tiny bathroom. I set my alarm and fell asleep. When the alarm went off, I groggily got up, showered again, shaved and dressed. I headed to the galley for a quick snack, which was much better than the awful burger I'd had earlier. Then I made my way to I was on the bridge just as Camila was finishing her shift. "Hello," I said with a smile. She looked at me, returning the smile. You did a great job with the launch, I said to lift her spirits. Thank you, she replied, a bit softer now. Maybe I'll stop by during your lunch break and we can spend some time together, I suggested, fully expecting her to come up with an excuse. To my surprise, she didn't. I'll set an alarm, she said playfully. There was a glint in her eyes. Maybe you can have me instead of one of those fake burgers, she teased. That would work for me. See you in 6 hours. I'll be there, she replied, giving me a quick kiss before heading off. I watched her walk away, feeling a sliver of hope that maybe we could make things work. Just as I turned back, I caught sight of Ironclad, grinning. About time you showed up, Turner said smugly. I glanced at my watch. My shift doesn't start for another 15 minutes. Commander, I replied calmly. I just wanted to talk to my wife before duty. For a moment, I thought he might get angry, but he just shrugged. Yeah, sure, he said, walking off down the corridor. I made my way onto the bridge and took over for Lieutenant Anderson, who handed over the shift and walked out as I started running the necessary calibrations. Alice approached me. How are you holding up? She asked softly. I'll be fine, Alice, I said, trying to brush. How are you holding up? She asked, sounding concerned. It's not easy, but I can handle it. Thanks for asking. Listen, I know you've got a lot on your mind, but I think you should keep an eye on Sila and Commander Harrison. I looked at her, shocked. You think something's going on between them? Maybe, she said, her tone cautious. Call it female intuition, but I've noticed some glances between them. Nothing obvious, but there's definitely something there. Okay, I said, my stomach twisting. Thanks for the heads up. I'm planning to meet up with her during lunch, hopefully that'll help. I hope so too. Jack, she said with a nod, but don't go telling the captain without solid proof. Accusing a senior officer without evidence could blow up in your face. I'll be careful, I assured her. Thanks for watching out for me, she nodded and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I finished the calibration and inspected the missile systems, making sure everything was in working order. By the time I was done, Captain Myers was back on the bridge. How about a little target practice? He suggested with a grin. Sure thing, sir, I replied, eager for the distraction. Launch some drones, Myers instructed. I set up 5 drones and activated the mini lasers, which were like old-school miniguns but fired beams of intense heat. The lasers quickly destroyed the drones. With pinpoint accuracy, nice work, Lieutenant Myers praised. Thank you, sir. Why don't you take the command seat while I catch a quick nap? Tool, timekeeper, communicator, tracker and vital signs monitor. The only time it wasn't worn was in the shower. I pulled up the tracking monitor and quickly located Ironclad in his quarters. His steady pulse was showing on the readout, indicating he was still wearing his device. Next, I checked Camilla's beacon and saw she was also in our quarters. Her vital signs were steady, asleep for a moment. I was tempted to check the tracker history, but I didn't have the right clearance. If I got caught looking at it, people would ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I wasn't sure I'd find anything incriminating, so I turned it off and went back to the bridge. Everyone was busy with their duties, so I just sat at my console, double-checking. I checked the systems and everything was running smoothly. We had a course adjustment coming up in about an hour, already programmed into the navigation system. The comms officer was in regular contact with Houston's flight control, so I didn't have much to do unless the captain needed me. About 2 hours into the shift, Petty Officer Marks came by to take drink orders. Ship regulations allowed us to have drinks at our stations as long as they had covers on. She came back with drinks for everyone just as I was heading off for lunch. Captain Mears came back to the bridge and sat down. I told him what had been going on and he nodded, making a few notes in his journal. Thanks, Lieutenant, he said. You can go and have a break now. He gave me a wink and I went off to our quarters. I stopped outside the hatch and took a deep breath before going in. Camilla was already up. Camilla was already awake, stretching as the alarm had just gone off. She asked with a teasing smile, and I grinned and joined her on the bed. I pulled her close and we shared an intimate moment. All the tension and doubts melted away for a brief while. "That was incredible," she said afterwards, her breathing still heavy. "I agreed. I missed you too," she said softly, leaning her head on my chest. "I love you so much," I replied, feeling a bit of the we had a great connection, but when I checked the time, I had to remind her that we had to clean up and get back soon. She nodded, but she seemed a bit down. I suggested that we could have round 2 during her lunch break, but she wasn't convinced. I took a quick shower and got dressed before leaving the cabin. I kissed her, then dimmed the lights and adjusted the gravity back to 0. 7. I went to the galley for a quick bite before my shift. I grabbed a tuna sandwich to refuel. Space love is nothing like in the movies. There are low-gravity blood flow and other physiological issues that make things complicated. The ship's artificial gravity helped, but it was still tricky. Scientists once thought that sending couples to space would be a bad idea. But advances in artificial gravity in the early 2000s changed all that. This allowed married couples to serve together under specific Camila, and I had found a way to make it work, but I couldn't help but wonder how much longer it would last after my sandwich. I made my way back to the bridge, arriving just in time. Captain Myers greeted me with a smile. "How was your lunch, good sir?" I said, taking my seat and getting back to my duties. Over the next 17 days, Camila and I saw each other during breaks. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep us going. I had limited interaction with Ironclad, which was a relief. Alice kept me in the loop about anything unusual she'd noticed so far. There hadn't been any major red flags, but something still didn't sit right with me as we approached Mars Station. I started feeling uneasy again. Something was off, and I couldn't shake it. When we docked, I was looking forward to a break with Camila at Hans's base. We'd planned to spend time together, just the two of us, away from the ship and its tensions. My plans were abruptly derailed when Ironclad informed me of an issue. I was surprised when I checked the systems just a few hours ago, and everything was fine. Lieutenant Anderson, who had been covering the shift before docking, explained that the issue cropped up right before we docked. "Something's wrong with the mini lasers," he said. I felt a surge of frustration. "I'll take a look at it," I said, determined to get to the bottom of the issue. "We've got 72 hours here," Ironclad reminded me. "Make sure those weapons are ready to go." I was feeling pretty disheartened by the time we got to launch. Camila gave me a reassuring smile and said it'd be okay. "We'll still get to Hans's base, and I'll be sure to bring you back a souvenir." Ironclad gave a little smirk as he added, "Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on your wife while you're busy." His words stung, and I clenched my jaw in silence. Captain Myers approached us, ready for some downtime. He asked, clearly unaware of the tension. "But Turner here needs to check out the weapons systems first." Ironclad looked at me and asked, "Is there something wrong?" "There's a problem with the lasers, many of which are out of calibration, according to Anderson." "When did this happen?" Myers asked, looking annoyed. "Just before docking," Anderson replied. Myers turned to me and said, "Lieutenant, I'll join you." I was grateful for his support. I threw a quick glance at Ironclad, who looked less than pleased. "I'll help too," Anderson offered, eager to be of assistance. "Much appreciated," I said. He gave me a look, but Captain Myers cut him off. "Go ahead. Number 1. He instructed, waving him off. Ironclad walked away, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as I watched him leave. I made my way to the weapons bay. Alice caught up with me. "Something's fishy, Jack," she whispered. "I'll keep an eye out while you're working." "Thanks, Alice," I said, grateful for her vigilance. Once I reached the weapons station, I changed into my work uniform, which lasers are having issues with. I asked Anderson, "Number 2 and number 5, sir." Anderson responded, "I'll handle number 2. You check number 5, but let's inspect them all." "Understood," I said, heading off to work on the other lasers. Captain Myers joined me shortly after I started unscrewing the control panel of Laser 2. "What's the situation?" he asked, pulling on his gloves just as I was about to find out. There's a broken gear in the drive system, I replied, prying the panel open inside. The clip that held it in place was missing. I muttered, inspecting the damage. What's the issue? Mears asked, stepping closer. Someone's tampered with this device, I explained, holding up the broken gear. The clip is missing and the drive gear is damaged. Could that have impacted the weapon system? He was clearly concerned. I confirmed that if the lasers had been active, they might have pierced the hole. How could this happen? It seems deliberate. I speculated that these systems are sealed. You need a specific tool like this one. Myers asked if I could use the tool to fix it. I said it could be fixed, but it'd take time. I thought it'd take about 8 to 10 hours, assuming no further issues came up. Myers said, I could really use some help with this. I thanked him, but I said I could manage it on my own. There's only room for one set of hands in here, I said. Anderson called in on Mum's lieutenant. The E-clip is broken on my end, and the drive gear is damaged. The clip is broken and the drive gear is damaged. I turned to Myers. We'll need to replace the entire control unit. I informed him and he agreed. Myers nodded and said, Get the armory to inspect all weapon platforms. Anderson replied, What are the odds of 2 control units failing simultaneously? Myers asked, his brow furrowed. It's pretty unlikely, I said. These units are some of the most reliable in our inventory. I've never seen one malfunction like this, let alone 2 at the same time. Could it be a manufacturing flaw? I doubt it, I replied. These systems go through rigorous testing before installation. I've worked with hundreds of them. We've never had an issue like this with these units. We need to let Houston know. Myers decided we'll bring in engineers from Mars Station and run a full Level 5 diagnostic. It's absurd that a $1 trillion spacecraft could be halted by a missing eclipse. I nodded in agreement and said I'd keep him updated on the progress. Yes, sir, I replied as he left. I turned back to the device and removed the control box entirely. I noticed a dark stain on the interior hole, which I thought might be transmission grease. But upon closer inspection, it looked like blood. I realized that whoever sabotaged the system had injured themselves in the process. I carefully used a pair of tweezers to collect a sample of the substance, and sealed it in a small bag. I used tweezers to collect a sample of the substance, and sealed it in a small container. I planned to take it to the medical facility for DNA analysis later. While an armorer replaced the faulty control box, my mind kept wandering back to Rick. He seemed determined to keep Camila and me apart, changing schedules and now perhaps sabotaging the weapon systems. His words about taking care of her only made things worse. The idea that she might have been unfaithful with him made me feel sick after the new control box was installed and a dry test run was successfully completed. I logged the maintenance and noted the lost time, which was 10 hours that could have been spent on shore leave. Camila didn't leave any extra clues in the log. Anderson said the installation was fine and there were no other issues. I told him to do a full visual inspection and inventory of all weapons and missiles on his way to the bridge. I stopped by the medical bay on my way there. How are you, Lieutenant Turner? I was greeted by a technician who asked if I would like a DNA test done. I said that we have the equipment, but that the final analysis will need to be verified by a certified lab. She explained that she would need to know whose blood it was, and I told her that I would get started. She said that it would take a few hours and that we would need to compare it to existing DNA records. Thanks, Chief. Just keep this between us, okay? She agreed, nodding. Thanks, I said, and left, heading to the bridge to give my report. Mears was waiting by the hatch to his ready room. Fix it, he said. Yes, sir, I replied. Lieutenant Anderson is checking the remaining systems now. Good. Step into my office, Lieutenant, he said, gesturing for me to follow inside. I found Alice and Commander Carlson, the ship's senior security officer. Alice closed the hatch and sat down. Thanks for coming so quickly, Mears said. He began addressing Alice and Carlson. We have a situation, he said. It appears there's been sabotage aboard the ship. 2 weapon systems were. I've been told to look into what happened before we got to Mars Station. I'm going to contact the Corps' Criminal Investigation Division, but they won't be here for at least 36 hours, so we have that time to gather as much information as we can. I'm going to let you both have full access to the tracking history." Carlson nodded and said he understood. "I need to know who accessed those weaponized units as soon as possible," he added. Mears continued, "This investigation must be thorough but discreet. We can't let the crew catch wind of this." "We understand," Carlson affirmed. "A team of engineers from Mars Station is conducting full Level 5 diagnostics on the—" Myers added that it'll take 72 hours. "The command doesn't want us departing with a potential sabotage on board." "What's the plan for the mission?" I asked. "The mission may be cancelled," Myers said flatly. "We can't take the risk." "To the medical bay for DNA analysis." "Good call. I'll follow up with Chief Benson." "Anything else?" We all shook our heads and left. "You have your tasks, Myers?" I secured my tool bag on the weapons console as I prepared to leave the bridge, but before I could, Alice called me over. Jack said softly, "Yes, ma'am." "I've been keeping an eye on Camila and Commander Harrison," she said, lowering her voice. "They're quite close," she added, showing me her phone. My stomach lurched as I saw the pictures of Camila and Rick entering a club together. In another set of images, they were seen entering a hotel together. It was pretty clear what was going on. "I'm sorry, Jack," Alice whispered. "I thought you should know." "Thank you," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I appreciate it. Will you tell the captain?" "I don't have a choice," I replied. "I'm glad you told me first." I left the bridge to catch up with Anderson. We completed the remaining system checks and conducted an inventory. My shift ended and I grabbed a quick snack in the galley before returning to my quarters, hoping for some rest. Sleep didn't come easily with thoughts of Camila and Rick swirling in my mind, but eventually I fell asleep. A few hours later I woke up, showered and dressed just as I was about to leave. Camila walked into the cabin looking refreshed. I asked her, trying to keep my voice calm, if she had enjoyed herself. She replied nonchalantly, "Yes, we had a good time." I stared at her, my anger bubbling beneath the surface. I asked her, "Sorry you couldn't join us. Maybe next time." "Engineers doing on the station?" she asked, changing the subject. "Routine maintenance," I replied shortly. "What's your plan now?" she asked, sitting down casually. "I'm going to rest," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "I'm off duty for the next 12 hours. Are you starting your shift?" "Yes," she confirmed, looking at me with a soft smile. "Did you manage to fix the issue?" "I believe so." I answered. "Good," she said, standing up. "Missed you out there," I retorted, unable to hold back anymore. "That's not the impression I got," she said, suddenly on guard. "What do you mean?" I asked coldly. "Anything you want to tell me," she pressed. "Nothing," I insisted. I asked her if there was anything else, but she said there wasn't. I was still suspicious, though, so I left the cabin. As I walked away, my mind was filled with anger and confusion. Had she really thought she could fool me that easily? Had she expected me not to notice or care? I went back to my station and noticed that Rick was absent. I continued with the diagnostics, focusing on my work to keep my mind off the mess with Camila. After about 7 hours, I realized I hadn't eaten, so I decided to take a lunch break as I finished up. I made the decision to confront Camila directly. I needed answers. I made my way back to our quarters, determined to have it out with her, but when I opened the hatch, I was greeted by a sight no husband should ever witness. There on our bed were Camila and Rick entangled together. The room's gravity had been set to 0. 9G, making everything feel just a bit heavier than normal. They both turned to me. Camila was caught off guard and scrambled to cover herself while Rick, with that smug grin on his face, simply adjusted his clothing and shut the hatch. Rick ordered coldly, his voice filled with arrogance, "What the hell are you doing here?" My mind was racing, but I kept my cool. "I live here," I said through gritted teeth. As Rick dressed, he chuckled to himself. Your wife told you we were just having a little fun, didn't she? He looked at me with contempt, and I could feel the heat rising in my chest. But before I could respond, Rick continued. Let's talk outside. Turner Mantle Man. Camila looked at me with a mix of guilt and shame, her eyes pleading. I'm sorry, Jack, she whispered. I'll talk about this later. I ignored her and followed Rick out into the hallway. I reluctantly went, but not before turning on the video recording function on my suit. We all had this feature, which was meant for documenting incidents during missions. I decided this would be one of those incidents. As we walked, Rick continued to mock me, talking about how Camila he'd come to him for support. He even praised my idea of adjusting the gravity in the quarters, saying it made things more interesting. When I asked him how long this had been going on, he smirked and said, "Second year at the Academy, Turner." She came to me for guidance, and well, let's just say she couldn't resist. I wanted to hit him to wipe that smug grin off his face, but I knew better. My career was on the line, and I wasn't about to let him bait me into doing something stupid. So you've always been there for her, huh? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Absolutely, Lieutenant, he replied, not bothering to hide his pride. I have an act for keeping her happy, and was that why you changed the bridge schedule? Turner Rick said with a smirk, it's all part of the job and the sabotage. I asked, feeling the tension in the air. Rick looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. Yes, he said, making air quotes around the word investigation. What's your next move? Planning to get rid of me? I asked, my fists clenched. He chuckled and led us into the elevator. Certainly not, Lieutenant, he said. Would I take out an... You think you've got me all figured out, but you've got me all wrong. We reached the airlock and Rick stopped. He'd been about to open the inner hatch and remove my space suit. He pulled out a small pistol and aimed it at me. You think you've figured it all out, huh? He said with a smirk. I know enough, I replied, my mind racing. What now? Are you planning to make... It looked like an accident. Rick's grin widened. It's simple, really. After discovering your wife's affair, you grew despondent. You sabotaged the weapon systems to frame me and then took your own life when she said she was leaving you. Who do you think the command will believe? A failed husband or a decorated officer like me? I took a deep breath, assessing the situation. The gravity was set at 0. It wasn't the best idea for a fight, but it could be done in one quick motion. I jumped up and hit Rick twice, sending him reeling before he could recover. I slammed the hatch shut, locking him inside the airlock. He banged on the door, furious. Let me out, Turner. You're making a big mistake. I've got one question. Commander, I said, staring through the small window. Did Camila know about your plan? Rick's face twisted into a sneer. Of course she did. It was her idea. Now open the door, Lieutenant. Before I make things worse for you, I reached for the control panel, but instead of opening the inner door, I hit the button to release the outer hatch. Rick's eyes widen in shock as he realizes what's happening. Wait a minute, he shouts, but it's too late. The outer door slides open and Rick is sucked into the vacuum of space. His body tumbled helplessly, caught off guard, without a suit, and he had only seconds before the air in his lungs expanded, causing excruciating pain. He would either I had just a few seconds to decide whether to suffocate or freeze. I activated the comms, man overboard, starboard airlock number 2. The alarm blared throughout the ship and soon a crowd gathered at the airlock. Captain Myers and Alice were among the first to arrive, followed closely by Camila. Commander Harrison, sir, I said, handing Captain Myers a day to drive. He confessed to sabotaging the weapons systems and having an affair with Lieutenant Turn. He also tried to kill me. And make it look like a suicide. It's all on here. Camila's face went pale as she peered into the airlock. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized Rick was gone. His body was now drifting in an unstable orbit around Mars, making recovery nearly impossible. You killed him! You fool! She screamed, tears streaming down her face. I hate you. That's enough. Lieutenant Mears interjected, stepping in to defuse the situation. He turned to Alice and said, "Take her to sick bay then." He turned back to me, his expression solemn. "You're relieved of duty pending the investigation, Turner." "I'll handle it." "All right, sir," I responded quietly. "That's it," Myers commanded, turning to the rest of the group. "Back to work. We've done all we can." "Understood, sir," Commander Carlson replied. "Once she's settled, find her a berth away from the bridge and reach out to Mars Station for the recovery of Commander Harrison's body." "I will, sir," she said, walking off. Mears then spoke to Alice. "It looks like you're stepping up. You're my new number one until further notice, but just for bridge duties for now." "The mission's likely been scrapped, yes, sir," Alice acknowledged. "We've wrapped up our initial inquiry," Myers continued. "We need to go over our findings in my quarters ASAP." Alice affirmed and then turned to me. Her expression softened. "I'm sorry, Jack. You didn't deserve any of this." "Thanks, Commander," I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. I went back to my quarters and gathered Camilla's belongings, packing them into her duffel bag. I wanted her as far from me as possible. Security later retrieved her things, but I didn't ask where they were taking them, and I didn't care. I flipped the mattress and replaced the soiled bedding, tossing the old linens into the laundry chute with restricted access to my quarters. I sat down at the computer console and filled out the divorce request since our marriage fell under JAG. Jurisdiction was also a factor in the divorce process. There were no children and our incomes were similar, so it was a straightforward split. She kept her stuff and I kept mine. After submitting the request, I waited for confirmation, knowing it would be processed within 24 hours. 2 CIA agents from Han's base reached out to me for questioning, hinting at a vengeful motive behind the events. Thankfully, the JAG officer present during the interrogation ensured I didn't say anything. The next day, I steered clear of the crew and kept to myself, trying to stay out of the gossip mill. I spent most of the time in my quarters on edge. Then, unexpectedly, Myers and Alice showed up. Lieutenant Myers began taking a seat as Alice joined him. Mars Station recovered Commander Harrison's body and confiscated the illegal firearm he had on him. "The CIA report confirms your actions." In his defense, he paused, then added that Commander Harrison's tracker shows he was present at both sabotaged weapon stations just before Lieutenant Anderson noticed the calibration errors. "The DNA from the blood also matches his," Alice added, confirming he was responsible for the sabotage. "Your wife claimed she knew nothing," Myers clarified, "but she'd been detained as an accessory to Harrison's plot against you. She could face conspiracy charges when we returned." "We're heading back to Earth, so?" I asked, trying to process everything. Myers nodded, and said the mission's on hold for now. "Jack, we'll face a board of inquiry when we return." "Can I resume my duties?" I asked after a moment of consideration. Myers nodded, and Houston agreed after some persuasion. "We've downed 2 officers, and we need you on the bridge. You can handle gunner ops, right?" "Yes, sir," I affirmed. "Good," Myers replied. "We launch in 12 hours, so make sure you're rested." "And I'm ready, thank you, sir." "May I speak with my wife?" "I need some answers." Myers gave me a searching look. "Are you sure about this, Jack?" "Absolutely," I confirmed after a brief pause. He consented. "All right, Jack, but Commander Powell will accompany you. Do you agree?" "Alice, yes, sir." Alice confirmed. "Very well," Myers concluded. "Now get to work and rest up. It's time to earn that paycheck." "Yes, sir," I responded as he left. Alice turned to me. "Ready, Lieutenant?" she asked. I nodded yes. We left together and made our way to the brig on the lower deck. As we walked, Alice broke the silence. "Captain Myers wanted me to tell you he commended you for what I asked. He was genuinely surprised. He believes your actions saved lives. If Harrison had fired that weapon in the airlock, things could have been much worse." "Damn," I muttered. Alice grinned. "Congrats," she said. We reached the brig and checked in with the. We approached a small cell where Camilla was sitting on the bed wearing an orange jumpsuit. She sneered at us as we entered. "Now it's just Lieutenant," Not even Jack or Lieutenant Turner, she said. I'm going to ask you a few questions and then I'll leave you alone. Go ahead, Lieutenant, she replied, staring straight ahead without acknowledging us. How long were you involved with Harrison? Since sophomore year at the academy, she admitted, her voice flat. He was my counselor. I know that much. I said. Where did it start? You really want to know? She challenged, turning to face me for the first time. Yeah, I do, I affirmed, standing firm. Fine. I failed the test and he helped me cheat after that. I owed him, so I entertained him. I enjoyed it, so it kept happening. She explained nonchalantly. So you cheated with him and betrayed me, is that it? I asked, feeling the bile rise in my throat. Yes, she confessed, her tone laced with venom. You don't know how many times I thought of him when I was with you. And you know what? I liked it. She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with cruelty. Here's something else. You never measured up. He's been to places you could never reach. I clenched my fists but forced myself to remain calm. Did you ever love me, or was it all a lie? I loved you, she said, her voice she softened for a moment, but I loved being with him too. It was just sex, nothing more. You knew about his plans once we boarded, didn't you? I asked, and she admitted, yeah, I knew. She said he staggered the shifts so we wouldn't see each other much. But you surprised us by talking to me, so we waited until Mars and you knew about the weapons sabotage. She confessed. I didn't think he'd go that far, and my supposed self, weren't you involved in the destruction too? I asked. It was his idea, but you went along with it. You never stopped him. I said no. She admitted, her voice was quieter now. I'm sorry. I never thought he'd actually go through with it. Well, he failed, and now you're going to prison. Was it worth it? I asked. My voice was hollow. It doesn't matter, she said, shrugging. I was proud of you for handling the ship so well. I do love you, but I regret ever meeting you. I turned to leave, but before I could step out, she called my name. She said softly. I didn't look back. Instead, I raised my middle finger and walked out. When I got back to Earth, Camila was in a federal prison while the investigation, the court-martial, was tough on the crew. Myers, Alice, and I gave our testimony over several days. My divorce was finalized in early April, with the JAG officer doing the paperwork on Friday, April 18th. We met in the hearing room. Myers, Alice, and I sat together as Camila entered in chains, with armed guards. The council members, dressed in their uniforms, took their seats. Admiral Bryant, the head of the council, began the meeting. He told everyone to take their seats and explained that this was a board of inquiry, not a trial. The aim was to find out what happened and stop it happening again. After going over the events of the mission, Admiral Bryant criticized Commander Harrison for putting personal agendas above duty, endangering the crew and damaging the ship. He then turned to me, Senior Lieutenant Jackson Turner. He said, addressing me formally. I sat up straighter. Your actions aboard the USS Liberty potentially saved lives and prevented further sabotage. In recognition of your diligence and bravery, we are awarding you the Distinguished Service Medal. He paused for a moment before continuing. You've also been assigned to the Advanced Operations School for training, starting June 1st. Thank you, sir, I said, trying to take in the moment. The Admiral then turned to Captain Myers. The Council acknowledges your efforts under unprecedented circumstances. However, as the ship's captain, you're ultimately responsible for its operations. Your command of the USS Liberty will remain, but a note will be added to your record. A new crew will be assigned following the ship's modernization. Admiral Myers responded, his expression serious. Lieutenant Powell will be promoted to commander and take over as your first officer, the Admiral concluded. Thank you, sir, Myers said finally. The Admiral turned to Captain Senior Lieutenant Camila Avery. He addressed her using her maiden name. Now that the divorce was finalized, Camila stood there, her face pale, her hands shackled. This board is deeply disappointed in your conduct, the Admiral continued. Not only did you disgrace your ex, you tarnished your uniform and put the entire crew at risk. Your actions, along with Commander Harrison's, have led us to reassess your entire record. Harrison's intervention helped you pass a critical test at the Academy. Without his help, you would have failed. Your piloting record is commendable, but you should never have been commissioned in the first place. The Admiral continued, You were commissioned, but your liaison with Harrison resulted in tragedy. You knew of his plot and did nothing to stop it. You will be dishonorably discharged, demoted to U1, and your pay will be reduced effective immediately. He then signaled to the guards who were escorting Camila out, and she passed by, tears streaming down her face. She looked at me and said, Jack, please. I told her it was Lieutenant Turner to you. She started to cry. She asked to be called Lieutenant. I said no. I told her to leave me alone. The guards took her away. She stopped crying. I didn't care what she said. The meeting was adjourned with a gavel. The meeting was adjourned, and we stood as the council members left the room. Once they were gone, Myers turned to me and said, Well, that wasn't too bad. He then remarked, How about a drink? I replied that I could use one and agreed that the ordeal seemed to be over. Alice chimed in, Count me in. The three of us left the hearing room and headed to the officer club, where we could finally toast to a bittersweet victory. 17 months later, I stood at the airlock of Galileo Station orbiting Mars, gazing at the stars and reflecting on how far I'd come. Camila's court-martial had concluded a month before I started the Advanced Spacecraft Management program in Florida. The prosecution had asked me to testify, which I did, although I did recall those dark days aboard. The Liberty was a pretty unpleasant experience. Camila had changed at her court-martial. She wore a crewman's uniform, stripped of her wings. She looked pretty frail and broken. The court found her guilty of being an accessory to my attempted murder, but acquitted her of conspiracy. She was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor and a dishonorable discharge after graduating from the Advanced Operations School. I was promoted to lieutenant commander and given orders to go to Galileo Station, a remote outpost orbiting Mars. When I arrived, I was greeted by Captain Allen, an attractive officer who gave me a briefing on the situation and said, Ready to see your new home for the next few years? She then led me to the observation deck, where she pressed a button to reveal the massive advanced spacecraft. USS Enterprise, this is your domain as my operations officer. I'm ready for the adventure, she asked, her eyes gleaming. I couldn't help but smile. Absolutely, Captain. We launch in 15 days, she said, shaking my hand. Welcome aboard, Commander. As I admired the sight of the USS Enterprise, the name emblazoned on its side, I smiled. It was time for another chapter. Music, music.